On the afternoon of November 3rd, 2023, the frost was just beginning to harden the deep limestone ridges of Crawford County, Wisconsin. At exactly 4:15 p.m., a $340,000 piece of agricultural engineering slipped quietly off the edge of a county road and vanished. It was a Case IH axial flow 8,250 combine harvester. With its tracks and empty grain tank, the machine weighed just over 44,000 pounds. It was the crown jewel of a massive custom harvesting operation run by a 34-year-old man named Carter Hayes. Carter was not a farmer who owned the land he worked. He was a contractor who chased the harvest across the Midwest. He owed $28,000 a month in equipment notes. He operated on the knife's edge of modern agricultural economics, where speed is the only barrier between profit and bankruptcy. The access road along the ridge had looked solid, but the driftless area of Wisconsin is geologically deceptive. Beneath a thin layer of packed gravel lay a shelf of fractured limestone and soft, saturated autumn clay. When the right track of the massive harvester drifted 3 inches too far toward the shoulder, the earth simply sheared away. Carter watched from the cab of his pilot truck as the combine tilted. It didn't tumble, it slid. It rode the collapsing shelf of mud 45 feet down a sheer 40-degree ravine, tearing through ancient oak saplings before slamming into the freezing muck of a seasonal creek bed. The impact buried the front drive tracks up to the axles in black, semi-frozen silt. The rear steering tires were suspended in the air. The harvester was wedged at a violent, unnatural angle, perfectly trapped in a geographical vise. Carter Hayes scrambled down the embankment, his boots sinking ankle-deep in the freezing mud. He looked up at the road, then back at his machine. He needed this combine in a cornfield by dawn, or he would lose a $60,000 harvesting contract. He pulled his phone from his coat. He didn't call a local farmer. He called the most expensive, heavily equipped commercial recovery outfit in a 50-mile radius. He was about to try and buy his way out of the earth's grip. 2 hours later, the quiet county road was bathed in the harsh, rotating strobe lights of modern industrial salvage. The recovery outfit had sent 2 Century 1000 150 rotator wreckers. These were not tow trucks. They were mobile engineering platforms mounted on Peterbilt 389 chassis, weighing 60,000 pounds empty. Each truck featured a 3-stage hydraulic recovery boom and dual 50,000-pound planetary winches. They represented an investment of nearly $800,000 per vehicle. The lead operator, a man used to clearing overturned semi-trucks from interstate pileups, took one look down the ravine and began barking orders. The wreckers were positioned side by side on the asphalt, their massive hydraulic outriggers deployed, punching steel pads through the frost and into the roadbed to anchor the chassis. The operators spooled out hundreds of feet of 2-inch synthetic Dyneema rope. Dyneema is a marvel of modern chemistry. Pound for pound, it is 15 times stronger than steel, incredibly lightweight and highly kinetic. The plan was brutal and direct. They would attach both wreckers to the rear axle of the combine, bypass any complex rigging, and use sheer hydraulic dominance to drag the 44,000-pound machine straight backward up the 45-degree slope. Carter Hayes stood on the pavement watching the thick synthetic lines go taut. He felt a wave of relief. In Carter's world, every problem had a price tag, and every physical obstacle could be overcome if you just applied enough horsepower. The 2 wreckers combined boasted over 1,200 horsepower and 200,000 pounds of winch capacity. It seemed mathematically impossible for the combine to remain in the hole. At 6:45 p.m., the lead operator hit the remotes. The massive diesel engines of the Peterbilts throttled up. The exhaust stacks blew black smoke into the freezing night sky. The thick synthetic lines rose from the brush, vibrating with tension as they lifted clear of the mud. But the earth does not respect a spec sheet. Pulling 44,000 pounds up a 45-degree incline is not a simple matter of dragging weight. It is an arithmetic problem governed by gravity, friction, and stiction. The bottom of the ravine wasn't solid rock. It was a freezing, saturated silt bed. The massive rubber tracks of the combine were deeply embedded in the mud, creating a perfect vacuum seal against the underbelly of the machine. To move the harvester, the wreckers first had to break that atmospheric grip. Engineers call this stiction. In deep clay and silt, Stiction can effectively double or triple the dead weight of an object. The wreckers weren't pulling 22 tons. They were fighting closer to 70 tons of atmospheric resistance, all while trying to defeat gravity on a steep slope. The winches whined. The synthetic lines stretched. This is the danger of kinetic rope. It acts like an immense rubber band. It was storing hundreds of thousands of pounds of kinetic energy, stretching up to 20% of its length. Down in the ravine, the massive green combine groaned. It shifted backward 2 inches. On the road, the 60,000-pound wreckers began to slide. The hydraulic outriggers ground across the asphalt, carving deep white gouges into the pavement. The front tires of the lead Peterbilt actually lifted 3 inches off the ground. The operators were pouring nearly maximum hydraulic pressure into the lines, trying to shock the combine out of the mud. Then, the physics of the driftless area issued its verdict. There was a sound like a shotgun blast echoing down the valley. The 2-inch Dyneema rope on the primary wrecker snapped near the combine's axle. Because it was kinetic, the rope didn't just fall. It violently unstretched, whipping back up the 45-degree slope faster than the eye could track. The frayed end of the synthetic line slammed into the rear steel boom of the wrecker, denting half-inch steel plate and shattering a floodlight. Silence rushed back into the freezing air, interrupted only by the idling diesel engines. The lead operator stepped out from behind his control panel, his face pale. He looked at the severed line, then down at the ravine. The combine had slid 3 feet deeper into the creek bed. "We're done," the operator said, shaking his head at Carter Hayes. "That mud has a vacuum seal on the belly pan. My trucks are sliding. You need a 200-ton lattice crawler crane to lift it straight up. It'll take 3 days to permit the road, $50,000 to mobilize, and they'll have to build a pad to swing it." Carter stared at the dark hole. 3 days meant the ground would freeze solid, encasing the undercarriage in concrete hard ice. $50,000 meant missing his next banknote. His expensive modern world had just collapsed. Let me stop here and tell you about Artie Vance. Everyone in Crawford County called him Artie. Artie was 80 years old, moving with the deliberate, stiff economy of a man who had spent 6 decades turning heavy wrenches on cold concrete. He didn't own thousands of acres. He owned a 40-acre patch of ridgeline at the dead end of a county gravel road and a corrugated steel shop that looked more like an industrial graveyard than a functioning business. But Artie's shop was not a graveyard. It was a museum of forgotten leverage. Artie survived the 1980s farm crisis, a brutal era when prime interest rates hit 20% and thousands of farmers lost their land to the banks by refusing to participate in the illusion of limitless debt. While his neighbors were borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy brand new computerized equipment, Artie made his living repairing the heavy, obsolete iron that the banks wouldn't finance. He salvaged axles, rebuilt planetary gears, and collected heavy rigging equipment that the modern world had deemed too slow to be useful. His prized possession wasn't a pristine modern wrecker. It was a 1968 International Harvester TD-15B crawler dozer. The TD-15 didn't have GPS, enclosed heating, or synthetic ropes. It had a naturally aspirated diesel engine that produced roughly 120 horsepower. But bolted to the rear of the crawler was a heavy-duty Tulsa mechanical winch, driven directly by the tractor's power takeoff. It was an arrangement built for logging the steep, unforgiving Appalachian and driftless ridges. Artie didn't believe in kinetic energy. He believed in mechanical advantage. He knew that when you are fighting the earth, speed is your enemy, and geometry is your salvation. At 7:30 p.m., Artie was sitting in his kitchen drinking decaf coffee when he heard the dispatcher chatter on his police scanner. He heard the rotator crews declare the harvester a lost cause. He heard the panic in the airwaves. Artie didn't rush. He set his coffee mug in the sink, put on a canvas Carhartt coat that was older than Carter Hayes, and walked out to his shop. He fired up his 1992 Dodge Ram dually, hitched up his heavy equipment trailer with the TD-15, and threw a heavy wooden crate into the bed of the truck. He was going to show the boys what 100 horsepower could do when you stop trying to force the earth and start asking it to yield. At 8:15 p.m., the deep, guttural exhaust of Artie's 1992 Dodge Ram echoed off the limestone cuts as he slowly backed his equipment trailer into the staging area. The wrecker crews were busy reeling in their severed Dyneema ropes and packing away their broken shackles. Carter Hayes was sitting on the bumper of his pilot truck, his head in his hands, mentally calculating the financial ruin of a frozen, abandoned combine. Artie parked, set the parking brake, and stepped out into the freezing air. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked to the edge of the ravine and looked down at the trapped case IH 8,250. Then he looked at the sheer angle of the slope and the thick, black muck holding the undercarriage. The lead wrecker operator, a man half Artie's age, watched the old mechanic walk back to his trailer. He looked at the faded yellow paint of the 1968 International TD-15B. To a modern towing professional, the machine looked like a toy. It weighed roughly 22,000 pounds, a third of the weight of a single Peterbilt wrecker. "You're wasting your diesel, Pop," the lead operator called out, not unkindly, but with absolute certainty. "We just put 2 massive rotators on that rig. It's vacuum sealed to the bedrock. You've got 120 horsepower there. You drop a line down that hole, you're either going to snap your PTO shaft or drag your dozer right over the edge." Artie didn't get angry. He understood why the younger man thought that way. The wrecker operator was trained in the modern school of recovery, where massive horsepower and explosive kinetic force were the answers to every problem. Artie unlatched the heavy wooden crate in the bed of his truck. "I'm not dropping a line down the hole, son," Artie said quietly, his voice carrying the rasp of a lifetime spent breathing diesel exhaust and grinding dust. "And I'm not pulling the combine." The wrecker boss frowned, walking over. "Then what are you pulling?" Artie hoisted a massive, rusted cast iron block out of the crate. It weighed nearly 80 pounds. "I'm pulling the pulleys." Artie Vance didn't just understand mechanics. He understood the unforgiving math of the driftless terrain. He backed the TD-15 off the trailer. The heavy steel tracks clanked and popped against the frozen gravel. He drove the machine to the absolute edge of the ravine, but he didn't point the nose down the hill. He turned the crawler sideways, positioning its 22,000-pound mass horizontally across the road, using the frozen shoulder as a natural trench block. Then, the arduous work of rigging began. Artie didn't use modern synthetic rope. He pulled heavy canvas bags from his truck containing hundreds of feet of 7-8-inch steel core wire rope. It was heavy, miserable material to handle in the freezing cold. Carter Hayes and 2 of the wrecker operators, their curiosity overriding their skepticism, helped the old man carry the heavy iron equipment down the steep slope. Artie wrapped thick, protective synthetic straps around the bases of 3 massive bur oak trees that stood like sentinels along the top of the ridge. These trees had survived a century of Wisconsin winters. Their roots were anchored deep into the limestone shelf. He didn't attach a single cable directly to the combine. Instead, he shackled 2 massive, antique McKissick snatch blocks to the front tow hooks of the harvester. Then, he shackled 3 more snatch blocks to the oak trees on the ridge. He took the primary steel cable from the heavy-duty Tulsa winch on the rear of his dozer, and he began to weave a web of iron. He ran the cable from the winch, down to the first block on the combine, back up to the first oak tree, down to the second block on the combine, back up to the second oak tree, and finally anchored it securely to the third oak tree. He had just built a 4-part line. By the absolute laws of physics, a 4-part block and tackle system multiplies the pulling force by a factor of 4, while dividing the speed by 4. The Tulsa mechanical winch on the back of the TD-15 was rated for roughly 40,000 pounds of line pull. 40,000 pounds wasn't enough to break the vacuum of the mud. But multiplied by the geometry of the pulleys, Artie was suddenly generating 160,000 pounds of mechanical force. And unlike the kinetic rope used by the modern wreckers, this force was entirely static. "You see," Artie told Carter as they climbed back up the icy ridge, "a helicopter or a fast winch tries to rip the mud apart. But the mud is mostly water, and water doesn't compress. If you pull fast, it turns into a solid wall. You don't break a vacuum, you peel it." At 9:30 p.m., under the harsh glare of the wrecker's floodlights, Artie climbed onto the open steel seat of the 1968 International. The cold was bitter now, dropping below 20 degrees. The young wrecker operators were bundled in insulated, heated jackets. Artie sat exposed to the wind in his old canvas coat. A vintage crawler has no cab, no heat, and no insulation from the violent vibrations of the machine. Operating it is not a job, it is a profound physical deployment. Artie didn't touch the accelerator. He reached down and engaged the power takeoff lever, linking the massive Tulsa winch directly to the torque of the diesel engine. Deep inside the heavy steel housing, massive iron gears meshed. The winch drum began to turn. It was agonizingly slow. The thick steel wire rope rose from the frozen ground. It didn't snap taut with a violent jerk like the Dyneema ropes had done. It tightened link by massive link, winding over the heavy cast iron blocks. The pulleys groaned, physically shifting on their heavy anchor straps as they aligned perfectly with the load. The line went completely straight, vibrating with immense mechanical tension. The TD-15 crawler squatted hard against the road. The massive steel cleats of the tracks dug into the frozen gravel. The front of the old tractor lifted a fraction of an inch off the ground as an incredible amount of force transferred from the earth into the steel frame. Artie held the winch lever steady. He was generating nearly 160,000 pounds of tension, but the 44,000-pound combine wasn't moving. The stiction of the deep mud was fighting back, holding the machine in a hermetic seal. The lead wrecker operator watched the heavy steel cable trembling. He took 2 steps back. He was absolutely certain the steel rope was going to snap under the multiplied load and cut a man in half. But Artie knew his steel. He didn't pull harder. He didn't rev the engine. He simply held the tension perfectly, mathematically constant. He sat perfectly still on the iron seat, his hand resting lightly on the lever, feeling the load through the vibrations of the machine. For 14 terrifying minutes, the diesel engine lugged. The steel lines hummed a low, terrifying mechanical note. Nothing moved. "It's not going to go," Carter whispered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "The mud's got it." Artie didn't say a word. He just waited for the earth to realize it had been out-leveraged. At exactly 9:46 p.m., a sound cut through the steady, rhythmic clatter of the International's diesel engine. It wasn't the violent crack of breaking steel. It was a deep, wet, heavy sucking noise coming from the bottom of the dark ravine. Down in the pit, the black mud packed tightly around the massive tracks of the Case IH combine began to separate. The vacuum was failing. By pulling constantly without jerking, Artie had given the freezing water and air in the saturated mud time to seep into the vacuum pocket beneath the combine's massive undercarriage. He had literally peeled the suction away. Carter Hayes dropped his hands. Down in the mud, the $340,000 harvester, dead weight in the clay, physically shifted backward an inch. The TD-15 crawler didn't change its pitch. Artie maintained the exact same winch speed, letting the 4-part geometry do the work. Another wet gasp echoed from the ravine, and the modern machine moved 2 inches, then 4. Once the primary suction seal was broken, the actual dead weight of the combine was easily overwhelmed by the 160,000 pounds of multiplied dragging force. The heavy steel wire rope spooled incredibly slowly onto the drum of the Tulsa winch. Artie reeled the massive machine up the 45-degree slope at a glacial pace. It was moving at less than 1 foot per minute. The massive combine plowed backward through the saplings, dragging a wave of frozen mud with it, moving steadily up the side of the embankment. The modern wrecker crews stood on the asphalt in complete silence. The blinking strobe lights of their $800,000 trucks illuminated a masterclass in geometry. They were watching a 55-year-old tractor and a set of iron pulleys from the 1920s defeat a problem that 2,000 horsepower of modern diesel and ultra-high-tech kinetic rope could not. But dragging a rig out of a hole is a marathon, not a sprint. And because of the 4-to-1 mechanical reduction, the process was brutally long. For every 4 feet of wire rope the winch pulled in, the combine moved only 1 foot up the hill. Artie sat on the open tractor seat for 3 straight hours, his hands working the levers, the freezing wind biting through his canvas coat. He didn't have a heated cab to retreat to. He just had the quiet, unrelenting endurance of a man who knew how to finish a job. By 1 a.m., the temperature had plummeted to 10 degrees. The massive Case IH combine breached the crest of the ridge, its rear tires finding the solid asphalt of the county road. It was battered, coated in a thick shell of freezing mud, and dragged backward across the center line, but it was entirely out of the trap. Artie disengaged the power takeoff. The Tulsa winch fell silent. The tension in the heavy steel wire rope went slack, dropping onto the frozen road with a dull clank. The old mechanic didn't jump down from the tractor in triumph. He sat there for a moment, letting his frozen hands rest on his knees, breathing in the cold air. Carter Hayes walked over to the 1,968 crawler. The young custom harvester looked at his rescued machine, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then looked up at the 80-year-old man who had just saved his livelihood. The frantic energy and corporate arrogance were completely gone from Carter's face. "I owe you my business, Mr. Vance," Carter said quietly. "If that combine had frozen in the mud, the bank would have pulled my fleet by Friday. What do I owe you?" Artie climbed slowly down the iron tracks, his boots crunching on the gravel. He reached out and unpinned the massive iron snatch block from the combine's drawbar. "The rate is $500, Artie said, his breath pluming in the halogen light. "And I'd appreciate a hand loading these pulleys back into my truck. They're getting heavier than they used to be." Carter stared at him. $500 was less than what the commercial wreckers charged for 20 minutes of idle time. The lead wrecker operator, the man who had confidently predicted that Artie would tear his transmission to pieces, walked over. He didn't say a word. He just bent down, picked up one of the massive 80-pound cast-iron pulleys, and carried it to the bed of Artie's Dodge Ram. His crew followed suit, silently packing away the old man's gear. They were seasoned professionals, and they knew when they had been beaten by someone who possessed a deeper understanding of the earth. As Carter wrote the check, he looked at the rusted pulleys sitting in the wooden crate. "Why didn't you buy a bigger tractor?" Carter asked. "With what you know, you could run a fleet of those big wreckers." Artie folded the check and put it in his chest pocket. "Because big machines make you think you don't have to wait," Artie said. "When you owe a lot of money, you can't afford to be patient. You have to force things. But when your iron is paid off, you have time to let the pulleys do the math." Artie Vance knew he wouldn't live forever to pull the modern world out of the mud. In rural communities, a patriarch's passing is usually followed by a familiar, tragic ritual, the estate auction. The auctioneer's tents go up, the tools are scattered, the machinery is lined up in the driveway, and the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime is sold off for pennies on the dollar to men who only see scrap iron. But there will be no auction at Artie's shop. Because Artie had never leveraged his land, there was no bank waiting to demand immediate liquidation to cover outstanding notes. His property, his tools, and his museum of obsolete leverage are already legally transitioning to his grandson, Matthew. Matthew is a modern mechanic. He understands computer diagnostics, diesel emission systems, and variable rate hydraulics. But he also grew up sitting on the steel fender of that 1,968 TD-15. He had watched his grandfather pull a massive, state-of-the-art harvester out of a ravine using nothing but geometry and an engine that was built before men walked on the moon. He understood that the heavy wooden crate full of cast-iron pulleys wasn't just old equipment. It was the physical manifestation of the patience that had kept their family independent. Matthew didn't plan to scrap the crawler. He didn't plan to sell the pulleys. Why would you destroy the very anchor that kept your family from washing away? There is a profound difference between holding on to the past because you are afraid of the future and holding on to the past because it works better than the future in the moments that actually matter. The men who built these machines understood something fundamental about the earth. It cannot be rushed. If this story meant something to you, if you grew up with a machine like this one, or if you know someone who did subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, and they deserve to be told, while the people who live them are still here to tell them. Have you ever used a block and tackle system to multiply your pulling force when the engine wasn't enough? Leave it in the comments. I read every one. And the engineering behind how low horsepower steam systems conquered the American frontier is a masterclass in applied physics. That's the hidden truth we explore in the next story we're going to tell. The 1,968 TD-15 is parked in the back of Matthew's shop today. It is fully fueled. The massive Tulsa winch is spooled perfectly tight with heavy steel wire rope, and the heavy wooden crate full of cast-iron snatch blocks rests securely under a workbench. The commercial contractors will keep pushing the limits of the agricultural harvest. They will keep bringing heavier combines, faster trucks, and larger banknotes. And eventually, the soft clay of the driftless ridges will give way again, and they will hit the absolute limit of what sudden force can accomplish. When they do, the old iron will be ready. Artie Vance's legacy is still sitting exactly where it belongs. And every autumn, when the frost hardens the ground and the massive modern machinery rolls past the county line, the rusted iron is waiting in the dark. That's what happens when you build in silence while the world laughs.